Hello friends, I wanted to do my book presentation for you this week on modern fantasy based on the Harry Potter series and specifically J.K. Rowling. I went to a bookstore and saw the latest book cover, and this is what it looks like. They are republishing the Harry Potter series, and this is book one in an illustrated way, and so I think they're taking a little bit of the movie and a little bit of the book and putting them together for the current day reader to enjoy. And the illustrations I found to be really intriguing, so here are some of the illustrations from book one that I think readers would really enjoy. I'm a big Harry Potter fan. I was a fan of the books before the movies came out, and when the movies came out I was also there opening night. So I would say that I'm definitely a Harry Potter fan, not just because of the actual interesting story that was fun to read, but also because I find the author, J.K. Rowling, to be very interesting. Here's some facts about her. Forbes named her the second richest female entertainer in the world, and up to that point, authors weren't really considered to be entertainers, and she is the only billionaire author in history. At the time that the Harry Potter series really caught public interest, the genre of fantasy wasn't really getting published. Up to that time, publishers felt like the readers just didn't want to read that. But because of the public interest, publishers began to accept manuscripts again, and since then we've got many series in the fantasy genre, such as Charlie Bone, Fablehaven, Twilight, Hunger Games, Divergent, Artemis Fowl, Shadow Children series, or they're also called Among the Hidden. So it's very common now to see series in fantasy, but up to that point, the only series you could get in fantasy really was The Lord and the Rings, which wasn't considered a children's series. Harry Potter is now a global brand with merchandise, amusement parks, clothing, food. It's a very big brand. All of the books for Harry Potter have set records as the fastest selling books in history. It dominated the New York bestsellers list for almost a decade, and there was a few years where all 7 books were on the bestsellers list, dominating the actual list each week, which made a lot of other authors upset, but I think Rowling enjoyed it. And there was definitely a public response worldwide, from children's all the way up to adults, that was unprecedented about any story up to that point. Her beginnings were an interesting story as well. She wrote Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which is the UK title, in 1995 on an old manual typewriter. She sent it to a reader to critique the first 3 chapters, and they recommended sending it to the Christopher Little literary agent, who sent it on to a very small publishing house called Bloomsbury, and the editor, Barry Cunningham, put it on his desk at home and forgot about it, and his daughter, Alice, who was 8 years old, picked it up and read the first chapter and demanded that he buy the book because she wanted to read more, and so that's kind of how it began. Bloomsbury bought her book for $2,250 and promised to publish 1,000 copies, which is not a lot of copies at all. And she was very excited about that, but he said not to quit her day job. She got a writing grant to continue writing the second book, and around that time Scholastic in the US got a hold of it at an auction and bought it for $105,000, and she said she felt very rich that day. So the Harry Potter series took 17 total years to write, and it has a total of 7 books. Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince sold more in its first day than the entire year for the Da Vinci Code book. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, her final Harry Potter book, sold 15 million copies in 24 hours, breaking the record of the previous 3 Harry Potter books, which were also record-breaking as fast-selling books. She doesn't like to give a lot of interviews. Most of her news is shared on her website from her to her fans. She's also been known to be very censored and controversial among the literary circles because they feel like she uses dark themes and religious undertones, even though she says she didn't have a particular religion in mind when she was writing it. The uptake from the Harry Potter series has been unprecedented, and people call it a kidult book because kids love it and adults like it. She did write it for children, not for young adults or adults. And yet, adults are fans of this book more than any other book in history. It's been translated in 65 languages, and since then, she has written an adult book, and this summer will be a second Harry Potter play in the form of a book that will be published, and I'm excited to try that out. So considering fantasy as a genre and the Harry Potter books, the thing I like to keep in mind is that a really good fantasy book needs to create a world, and that world needs to be incredibly believable to the reader, because the reader will analyze every detail of the world to make sure that it makes sense. Fantasy in general is usually not taught to students in a school setting. It's maybe mentioned, but it's really not taught deeply. Kids are very polar about fantasy. Some children love fantasy as a genre, and some really hate it, especially science fiction, the subcategory in fantasy. And the thing to keep in mind when you're analyzing the world that the author creates is to look for the peculiarity of the details. So I liked in our required reading the things to keep in mind when you're evaluating. Is it believable? Does the reader feel like they're in that world? Is the setting described in such a way, so detailed, that you feel like you know that world? So Harry Potter, when it began initially, it was in its own category, and no one quite knew what type of fantasy book it was. It wasn't really a low fantasy. It wasn't really a high fantasy. It wasn't considered modern fantasy or science fiction, and so it has created its own subcategory called historical fantasy, where the world is filled with magic. It's in a different dimension of our world that Muggles don't have access to or can't see, but it's set kind of in a historical time of our world. So if you're going to analyze each of these bullet points of the Harry Potter wizarding world, there's definite discussion points, and if you want to, in the comment section, discuss how you feel J.K. Rowling did in plot, characters, themes, settings, style, emotional impact, imaginative impact, and vision, you would see that she gets high marks in most of these things. People who read the Harry Potter books really do feel like they know her characters. She writes the dialogue in such a way that each character has almost an accent to them, and you feel like you know them. There is some debate about which of her characters is dynamic and which are static. Dynamic meaning that they change over time, and static would be the steady characters that never really change, and so that the main character can show change. Some people say Harry Potter is the dynamic character, while Ron and Hermione are static, and others disagree. That they say Harry's in the first book, he's the first type. He is the same character as he is in the very end. He's always getting into trouble. He's still courageous. He's still loyal. So that's an interesting thing to kind of debate. As far as setting goes and style, J.K. Rowling is known for dialogue-heavy, action-packed, fast-paced writing. So emotionally, you get invested very early on in her books, and then she does a lot of describing of the world, and then toward the end of her books, there's a fast-paced action sequence. So that's what she's known for. I personally love to read the Harry Potter books by listening to them, and I would highly recommend getting CDs or audio cassettes of the books. The thing I enjoy about it is this performer, Jim Dale. He is an excellent performer for reading books audioly. Is that a word? Audioly? And he does the accents. I just really love him. So if you're going to have a book on tape, this would be one to get. My latest birthday, my brother sent me this journal that he said just looked just like me. He got it in a strange little store that looked like a magical store, and he felt like it looked like a Harry Potter textbook with sewn pages on the spine. Sorry, my iTunes popped on for a second. Anyway, my brother gave me this book, and he thought it looked like a book from the Magical Creatures class, and I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite prized possessions now, and it's real leather. The other thing I've come across lately is how J.K. Rowling organized her book. And so this is one of her books, and how she planned out how long it would take to write each chapter, and the title of her chapters, and the plot that would happen in those chapters, and how the prophecies would be revealed in those chapters, and little nuggets and foreshadowing, and on and on. And so you can see throughout her books, she organizes herself so that there are little nuggets that make things believable, and that the reader and diehard fans take the time to analyze. And so I really enjoyed this book. I'm trying to remember if this was Order of the Phoenix or another one. I'd have to look at the book chapter titles. So in general, Harry Potter has broken many, many children's book records. It is considered still a children's book. It has never won a children's book award. However, from the public, it has had huge cultural impact. And I've shown this slide before about this is a description of what typically describes quality children's books. And Harry Potter is considered an influential game changer when it comes to children's literature. However, it breaks many of the rules that were typical before. In the past, children's literature had to have an absence of harshness, and there's definite strong themes of death, evil, goodness in the books, and children seem to be fine by reading it. Also, number 5 and number 6 and number 7 usually describe what children's books typically are, and yet all the Harry Potter books are known to be very scary and long, and there is some occasional swearing. So those didn't seem to bother children, and a lot of adults have had some opinions about it. But as far as children go, the largest of the books is book 4, over 800 pages, and even readers who are struggling readers do take the time to get through that book because they want to hear the story. So the shortness didn't seem to be a factor for kids. The simple vocabulary that usually is in a children's book was also different in Harry Potter. She does have quite an expansive vocabulary that she uses, plus she makes up words too, and many of them are long. And so this is just an example of how not only did Harry Potter break a lot of records, but it broke a lot of rules, and kids and adults found it beloved despite all that. Thanks.